So here's the question. Where is the Pacific Northwest? And you've all had a chance to look at that and to express your view on that. And if you look at the maps of students that made it onto the forum, and quite a few students were able to do that, that's great. And if you weren't, hopefully emailed it to me. Um, Either way, you get credit. But I would recommend first, if you haven't had a look at those, that maybe you just stop the video here and go look at the forum. You can go in, if you've posted, you can see it. If you haven't, you'll get some idea nonetheless of that from what I'm going to talk about here for the next few minutes. So one way of thinking about the Pacific Northwest is just to ask a authoritative source. And the Pacific Northwest Atlas that's been published for years by Oregon State University Press, and they've, I don't know how many editions, I think they had 6 or 7 editions, and I've used a couple of those in my classes, maybe 3. They haven't updated recently, so I've kind of faded a little bit on that, but it's still available on it's clickable on the syllabus, so, and we will from time to time have a look at it, so you might keep that in mind. And there, remember what that, maybe you haven't had a chance to look at it yet, which is fine because I haven't really asked you to. But it's a standard map, kind of like the one that we're looking at right here, where it's, this was on, it's an old one, Amazon 1950s. And it's basically the kind of standard, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho map. And so that's the OSU one, and this is a different one, but it's the same map. I mean, basically they're saying this is the Pacific Northwest. Now, most of you didn't choose that. That's fine. I mean, there isn't really a exactly right answer. Depends on who you're asking. But one of the things that I learned growing up as I passed from living in Wyoming and northern Idaho and eastern Washington, and then traveling a bit here and there, is that I really never knew, unless I happened to be on a highway, when I was crossing a state or even international boundary, really. If you go up into some of these long valleys of British Columbia, they seemed about the same. And I remember going up into British Columbia in the west part as well with my grandparents when I was young, and or my parents rather, and my sister, and that seemed, the climate seemed the same. I mean, the people were a little different maybe, but really it was a similar experience. And I went to Yellowstone when I was maybe 11 years old, and I kind of, I think once you've crossed a lot of these state boundaries, you realize that there's a lot of unity and commonality, even when you're in western Montana or a little bit in western Wyoming. So that's one definition, and it's fine, no big deal. There's another one that we can look at. We'll just kind of go to this map that I had you look at. And it's kind of interesting. I mean, you could still do the 3-state boundary thing, and that's cool. But if you just sort of look at this and, don't really know where the state lines are, you're not really quite sure where to draw it. I mean, there's kind of a continuity. If you just take this coastal strip, for example, it seems to be pretty much an unbroken greenness all the way down to San Francisco. And that's kind of interesting. And well, how far north do we go, right? So you look up here and, gee, there's mountainous coast here and green forests. Who knows, right? Snow-capped mountains, etc. And so anyway, looking at this, a lot of you gave me either like a kind of 3-state thing, may expand a little bit. A lot of you went south of the California-Oregon border, maybe about to here, kind of worked your way up. There's a lot of you who cut off a bit of the basin and range part of Oregon. Maybe you've traveled there and kind of are aware that's a little different. There's a bunch of ways that it's different. We're going to look at a few of those. A lot of you would include roughly Yellowstone, maybe a little bit of western Montana, or maybe not. And then where do we go? Do we go into British Columbia? So there's those kind of questions. And when you zoom into one of these kind of areas, let's just zoom into the British Columbia question for a moment. I mean, it's not part of the United States, right? So, I mean, we can't be part of the Northwest. And there's a bit of what we could call a continental divide line here. Maybe some of you noticed that if you zoomed in. And what that means is if you're on the west side of the divide, all the rivers flow to the Pacific. And if you're on the east side, they go the other direction, which usually means eventually into either the whole Mississippi River system if you're in the States, or interestingly, if you look here and you look north, really much of northeastern British Columbia goes up and it flows through this whole lake system and ends up in the Arctic Ocean. So yeah, it's not just flowing to the Atlantic. So I mean, you have that whole kind of thing happening there. Knowing where do you cut off? I mean, you can see, for example, these rivers. If you zoom in a little more, you've got the Fraser River system and the whole Fraser Valley. And so, there's a lot of possibilities. And so I cut off in my depiction of it, I cut off a little bit of the northeast corner of British Columbia, and just kind of recognizing that a lot of this flows up this direction. The watersheds do. But in any case, there's other ways of thinking about it. So that's a common one. And what that really is um, an ecotopia kind of look, or basically it's this Cascadia concept. And so this Cascadia concept, British Columbia does extend up beyond here, but this is just the watershed one. The watersheds that flow to the Pacific, basically. And this is it. I mean, basically there's a thing that seems like the Continental Divide here, or maybe even a little on this side of it, but it ends up being defined by this line. And as you go into the United States, you've got quite a little chunk of western Montana in there, and a little hunk of West Yellowstone, and so on. And the cutoff line here at Oregon is roughly about here in Oregon and California. And you can see there's some basin and range territory. Why? Because any water that originates here, rains, snows, melts, whatever, is actually an internally drained basin. It doesn't go anywhere, not to the Pacific either. So, I mean, you have that kind of thing going on too, where even historically salmon never ran in here, so it doesn't quite qualify. So this is one definition that kind of has some logic, at least in terms of how rivers work. It's international. Many states are involved. Oregon loses some of its territory out of this, if you care about that. Well, how can we cut off Oregon? It's all part of the Pacific Northwest, so I won't take sides on that. But basin and range down here is a very different territory. You probably learned a little bit about basin and range if you've done the week one stuff. So that's another look at it. And so what I'd like you to do as well is just go into that Cascadia. It's basically Cascadia Department of Bioregion.org, and then you might want to just have a look at that. And what I would like you to read in that, I want to stop the video and write that down, or just search it out. You'll come into that Department of Bioregion.org. It has Cascadia in there. But look at a primer, depending on how you like to say that. And there's, you can see it's kind of interesting. There's considered a bioregion, a movement, idea that we could unify this whole region and make our own country or something, or some economic area. And so what are the basic points then of this, a primer or a primer section? So just have a quick read through it. And as you can see, it's not a lot to read. Just read it and have a good sense of that. I might ask you to write a really, really short essay or something, just summarizing more or less what that's all about. Just to have some familiarity, okay? And then there's also in that site, you'll see the 9 regions. This is kind of fun. And this, you don't need to know all these at this point, but we will talk about a lot of these regions. There's a kind of Cascade Plateau, and you've already kind of seen this. So this is basically the basalt plateau, really, that you saw in Unit 1. I mean, more or less, that's what this is. There's, just to kind of go through it quickly, the first waters, that's kind of a new or a novel thing to think about. So these are all the headwaters of the tributaries of the Columbia and the Fraser River, the Great Fraser River, which, by the way, has had historically similar numbers of salmon to the Columbia and roughly similar discharges. Well, people don't know that, but it's a great river in Canada. It actually covers less surface area, but a lot of snow melt and an enormous amount of water flows in the Fraser River. Then the next one is the Upper Cascadia. So this is where our definitions of where do we end with Cascadia. They take it all the way up and a little bit of southeast Alaska, also include Juneau further south. And that's more northwest than anywhere else, right? It's further west and farther north, so who might argue with that? Climatologically, it doesn't really work very well with some things we're going to be looking at this week. But still, that is certainly a legitimate definition, and it does come way down even into areas closer to home for us as well. So Upper Cascadia, I think they could have named that better maybe in some ways. Upper, okay, I guess we know what it means anyway. The Klamath Mountain region, you might recall the Klamath complex was actually a big terrain that microcontinent that docked onto the side of our own coast and built out a long time ago. So it's an immigrant addition, as is Vancouver Island and many others, as we saw last week. And the lower Salish Sea. Now, the Salish Sea is something to make a note of. We're going to spend some time thinking about the Salish Sea as an area roughly from here down into the Sound and then over into the Strait as well of Juan de Fuca. This is a region that has a lot of kind of internal unity and history as an interior waterway, coastal sort of, but not on the coast, okay? It's kind of an interior waterway, its title and so on. A lot of tradition there with the Salish Sea, going back to pre-Columbian times. So we're going to watch some videos on that later in the term. Very interesting region, a lot of stuff happening there, a lot of resistance there to change, and we'll look at some of that, what they're resisting. The Salish coast itself, which is a transnational boundary as well, so it's just the Salish Sea, but the Salish coast. The Snake River, okay, so that was almost all that was in all of your, I think a couple of you did a Washington, Oregon definition, which is fine. This course is mostly in Idaho, a little bit in Wyoming and Montana, and a little tiny bit of Nevada in there as well. And just even a corner of Utah, really, right where roughly where the Bonneville flood came through, Snake River zone. Okay, and that's a big basalt region as well. Vancouver Island, again, its geologic history is basically plastered onto the side of the continent. The Willamette Valley, that's home for a lot of us. I don't know how many of you grew up here, but for a lot of us, it's home. And so that's our quick look at the region. So, this is just one way of thinking about the region. I like it just because it's kind of environmentally consistent. You can kind of think about some commonalities there. And then when you look at our climatology piece on seasonality of precipitation, you'll see how well BC fits in there. And the answer is sorta, okay? But also the Rockies, there's kind of a transition, though. It's kind of neat how it works out. There's clearly a signature, quick preview, if you haven't done the climate part yet, where it's the dry summer, wet winter. That's kind of the unity of the region. And that really holds up a little bit into British Columbia in the interior, definitely on the coast in British Columbia. And it holds up in Washington, or rather in eastern Washington, northern Idaho, not so much in western Montana, even on this side of the Continental Divide. But much of Idaho does fit that as well. So, and almost all of Oregon except for the southeastern parts and south central parts. So the idea of a dry summer, wetter winter holds up as really a fairly unifying concept for almost all the regions. So that's kind of cool, or all the region if you wanted to define it that way. Might be a little narrow for my taste, but that's fine. Okay, so, well, I hope this is interesting to you just to sort of get a handle on it. And it also helps us appreciate that a lot of what we call the Pacific Northwest, we have a lot in common. The trees that grow here, the forests, climatologically, culturally, depending on how you want to look at that, maybe to some degree. And so we'll be revisiting this in one way or another from time to time the rest of the term.